Well, honestly, guys, I find this to be one of the weirdest stories I've heard in a really, really long time. And although it falls into a rumor category, it's so stupid it makes me feel like it's completely true because it's about Sony Pictures. Let's take a couple minutes to talk about this new rumor that's claiming that Sony Pictures is actually blocking Marvel Studios from some characters, how this is working out, and why it seems to me to be just a terrible idea. Well, Sony and Marvel have had a pretty long relationship. After several failures and some financial straits, Marvel Studios and Sony Pictures worked out a deal several years ago to bring Spider-Man into the MCU, and this saw Tom Holland come to life in Civil War and then again in Spider-Man Homecoming. Now, since then, he's become a mainstay of the MCU, and actually we had a bit of a scare a few years ago when the deal between Marvel and Sony kind of fell apart. Now, the current deal in place between these Hollywood giants as it relates to Spider-Man can quite honestly be a bit confusing, and this new information, well, it definitely muddies the water. Now, in case you didn't know, Sony maintains the live-action rights to Spider-Man and all his villains and supporting characters. It's kind of like an exclusive license to use those characters in this mediums, and nobody else will have access to it. Now, the deal they worked out with Marvel Studios is basically them relending that character, Tom Holland Spider-Man, back into the MCU, and why he can appear in these co-productions between the two studios. Now, since this has been going on, Sony has totally pushed ahead, creating their own Sony Spider-Man universe, and this has featured, well, quite honestly, some films that haven't been too well received. Now, the universe kicked off very nicely with Venom, but then we got Venom 2, which was a decent film, but definitely not as good as the first, and then two mega absolute flops in the form of Morbius and Madam Web. Now, we have Kraven the Hunter coming up this winter, and although this film could possibly break the trend, it's very likely not to fare so well. Now, this is where it gets weird, because according to Daniel Rickman, and obviously this isn't from Marvel or Sony, so we want to take it with a grain of salt, but apparently, and I quote, whenever Sony uses a villain, they block Marvel Studios from using them, which means there aren't many left for MCU Spider-Man to face off against. Now again, this isn't coming from Marvel or Sony themselves, so we want to be very, very careful here. But it does make sense that studios would not want competing versions of the same character. The last thing a studio want is to put out a flop, say like Morbius, only to have Marvel turn back around and bring Morbius to life in the MCU and knock it out of the park. We have no idea what this actually means for things like Spider-Man 4, but would Sony really prohibit Marvel from using a character in a project they also have a major stake in? We do know many people have wanted for a long time to see Tom Holland's Spider-Man face off with Tom Hardy's Venom. And that's been a really complicated issue in this sort of league. Well, that would explain why. Now, I wouldn't be too worried, because even if this turns out to be accurate, let's be real, Spider-Man has one of the most extensive rogues galleries in comic book history, probably second only to Batman. So there are plenty of characters for Marvel Studios to pull out and face off with Tom Holland's Wallcrawler. I also think we should keep in mind much of this is likely to change after Secret Wars. It does appear like many of these Marvel worlds are converging, and we heard a long time ago that these Sony characters might be part of the MCU in the future, in the post-Secret Wars timeline. And if that's the case, and Doctor Doom uses the Sony Spider-Verse as one of those worlds to create Battle World, well, it kind of resolves the issue across the board, but you do have to wonder what's going on behind the scenes and how Marvel and Sony work out future deals. Obviously, we want to see Spider-Man stay in the MCU, but I would like Marvel to be able to explore some of these great characters and have them face off with Spidey. I would love to see a Tom Holland version of Kraven's Last Hunt, or Madam Web be a bigger part of the MCU, or even Morbius be in Midnight Suns. But as things stand right now, that doesn't look very possible, and sadly, I don't know if Marvel and the current state of Sony will ever reach a deal where this actually happens. But we're going to have to wait and see.